Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about something that is really important to me and has really changed my life, and that is Jenkum.
There's a new way for your kids to get high. They're using raw sewage.
I couldn't imagine doing something like that. Sounds pretty sick to me.
Honestly, they need to find something better to do with their life. Seriously.
Something new, something stimulating, something different.
There's a lot of people that say it's a hoax or it's not real or it's just made up or whatever. Now let's just get this out of the way first, so you can laugh it all off or whatever, You won't be laughing once you experience what I have and have your life change. But, it's human waste. It's, shit.
Oh, that's good. I better get that out of the way before we get started. I am, what do you call it? I recently found out that I have celiacs. I think I've always been gluten intolerant my entire life to some extent, because anytime I don't drink, but anytime I tried to drink alcohol when I was a younger guy, I always got super sick. And I just thought it was because I had no tolerance built up for the alcohol.
Yeah, you didn't know if it was the poison coursing through your veins.
Right. I was like, is this the poison or is this the wheat? And I don't know if there's a correlation. There's actually a study being done on it right now at Oxford. Is there a correlation between people getting celiac after they've had COVID? I've had COVID 3 times in almost 3 years now. It'll be 3 years then. Yeah, I've had COVID 3 times.
Are you trying to win a bet?
Yeah, no, not at all. I think I was one of the first people to catch it. Like the sickest I was like November, December of 2019. And I was doing rideshare driving on the side, and my girlfriend was working at this major event in downtown LA. And we were just around people nonstop. And I was driving just coincidentally because of that timeline. I was driving a ton of like international tourists because it's, the holidays. And so for people that live in parts of the world that are sort of like, it's kind of a weird vacation time. Like if you live in Australia and it's like summertime for your Christmas, sometimes those people will come to the States to do the holidays because it has a little bit more of a Christmas feel. Why you would come to LA instead of going to like Chicago or New York is beyond me, because LA is not much more, Christmas weather anyway. But anyway,
I'm in the Northeast, so Christmas to me is like either Philadelphia or New York, and it's just like big trees.
Yeah, exactly. I grew up where are you from on the East Coast?
I'm from New Jersey, boring parts, like the top of South Jersey.
Oh, okay, cool. So I grew up in Philadelphia, so we're from the same neck of the woods.
Okay, basically. I'm from basically Burlington County. Moved a lot.
I know that area. I grew up in Delaware County, just outside of Philly, and I was just back there in May visiting family and stuff. But so the first time I was sick was like December 2019. I was sick for like 10 weeks. And then I had started getting some COVID-like symptoms in June of 2020, like right in the middle of the pandemic. And I went and got tested and tested positive, but I was only sick for like a week. I had like the sniffles or whatever. And it was probably because I had immunity built up from the first time, but it wasn't like I could go get tested back then. Nobody knew what COVID was in December of 19. My doctor was just like, yeah, it's this new flu that's going around. You'll get over it. And then,
I hope you're one of the people that PBS interviews like 50 years from now about the pandemic. And you're like, yeah, my doctor was just like,
yeah. She was like, yeah, it's just this new flu. You'll be fine. My doctor was like, you have bigger issues. Like you're overweight. Maybe you should work on that. My doctor is one of the things I love about her, she's very direct. She's like, listen, you need to lose like 60, 70 pounds. So if you're not going to do anything about that, I'm not going to give you something for your flu. You just get your health in order.
I like this idea of like, you either care about all of it or you get no medicine.
Yeah. It is kind of an interesting perspective of just like, why would I give you medicine if you're just going to eat like shit, kill yourself? Anyway, she's got a point.
Real quick, because I always mess this up. I put my name in as Bertrand, but I should probably do the @ I should probably do the Twitter.
Yeah, you can do that if you want. I think you can do it or I can do it. Let me check.
Oh, I got it. I got the edit name. I've gotten this far.
StreamYard. Yeah, I always use my tag. That way, if somebody stumbles on this video, they can go find me. There you go. Perfect. So, yeah, I had it 3 times. And over the last, I guess it's almost been 2 full years since the first time I got sick was like November of 2019. But I forget the whole point of why I even brought that up, why I was talking about getting sick. So I'm glad it obviously wasn't that important. But yeah, man, excited to have you on, Bertrand. Do you go by Bert or Bertrand?
I end up with both, to be honest.
Oh, do you? So, do you have a preference?
Nah, I don't give a shit. I have a running joke where I'm trying to become the most famous Bertrand. There's really just Bertrand Russell and then Bertram from Mad Men, and I think I'll overtake Bertram at least. Probably not Bertrand Russell.
Yeah, I wonder if because Bert Kreischer's name is spelled B-E-R-T, and I wonder if his is short for Bertrand.
Yeah, I never knew if he was like a Robert or if he is a Bertrand.
Yeah, you know what? Just knowing that he's from Florida, he's probably a Robert, but he could be a Bertrand. Actually, no, he's an Albert. There you go. I was way off.
Why not Al?
Yeah,
I ended up with this name. I'm not a fan of it, but I don't think I would intentionally pick Bert.
I think we're all naturally supposed to hate our names. Like I grew up hating the name Joshua, and everybody, and my mother calls me Joshua. Everybody else calls me Josh. But it's so funny because like when I broke into entertainment, people are like, Josh Denny, what a great entertainment name. Like I picked it as a stage name, and I was like, no, that's a terrible name. I can't imagine that would be a good name for an actor, entertainer, comedian, or anything like that. And my middle names, I have a hyphenated middle name, James Valentine. I was like, that would have been a much better stage name, and it's actually the name of the guitarist from Maroon 5. So I was like, yeah, I should have been Jim Valentine. It would have been great. And then as my comedy career started taking off, it would have saved me a lot of trouble of like still being able to have some anonymity using my legal name. Yeah. Which I didn't. You never think like, but I should probably have like a stage name in case I ever like get large enough to then want privacy. You don't ever forecast both of those things happening. Like you don't ever forecast becoming famous or infamous, and then you also don't ever forecast needing to pull back from that at any point in your life. So I did not have the foresight to play with names at all.
Yeah, I really didn't have that much going on for me, and I don't know how many academics or people who like do freelance journalism on like education statistics are like, you know what? I need to protect my private life. This is really going to blow up. People are going to love these education stats.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting too. So you and I kind of found each other, and this is always my favorite way to have new guests or meet new people and have them on the podcast. Is I was talking about something on Twitter, and then one of my followers, who's actually a friend of mine in real life, Roxanne Hodge, shared your article that was sort of intimating something, or not intimating, I was intimating, but you essentially expounded on this idea I had that, not all diversity is really checking the true box of diversity in terms of giving you a different perspective or different things like that. And her and I had long conversations about this in person. We'd done an event together back in May in LA. And, kind of talked about the fact that even though she's a woman of color, because she's conservative or even libertarian, she kind of gets pushed out of the conversation a lot in terms of being involved in Hollywood and entertainment, sort of checking the diversity box. And I always thought like, wow, this is a really interesting thing that it's like to be black or indigenous or gay or non-binary is often not quite enough. You need to have sort of this ideological alignment with the people already in Hollywood too. So I guess to kind of get us started, how did you tell me your story a little bit and what got you interested in the subject and what led to you sort of uncovering that and writing that story? And in a minute, I'll share it here for people to be able to check out and click the link.
Sure. It's a pretty quick story to tell. I mean, at this point, a decade or so, or closing in on a decade past, like Trayvon Martin, most people are familiar with the bullet point statistics. I'll just call them the statistics of oppression that race activism normally uses. And these have revolved around incidences of police shooting, who lives in poverty, who lives in concentrated poverty, school to prison pipeline, extrajudicial killings, police violence, over-policing. Basically, the statistics in which bodies are either stacked or degraded rapidly are the ones that most activist movements use. This isn't just race.
Yeah, the sexiest ones, right, are the most egregious.
Yeah. I don't know what it says about us as Americans, but on the whole, you need to lead with things that all of us agree are terrible fates. If you want to move us to action, you can't really some of us are very moved by stories of microaggressions, but the average American, it's like, is somebody being killed? Is somebody being imprisoned? Is someone being cut off from most of the things that would make life worth living? And if it's not in one of those three categories, it's very hard to get us to be concerned. For whatever.
Yeah, that's a really astute observation. I've said all the time, like the most dangerous sentence from any oppressor to any oppressed groups of people is they've had it good enough for long enough. And most challenges get diminished. I mean, even in the civil rights movement, white supremacists and racists were saying, I don't know what black people are mad about. They've had it good enough for long enough. And it's almost like this long running sentence that people have that they essentially use to say that, like, this issue isn't important enough, or this issue isn't severe enough. So that kind of lends credibility to your point of, like, until we get into the if it bleeds, it leads realm of DEFCON 5 when it comes to injustice, we're really sort of ambivalent to it. We really don't seem to activate or care or give a shit too much. It's sort of like over-policing has existed for a long, long time. It's been an issue in poor communities, not just black communities, but poor communities around the country forever. And it's unfortunate that the only time we sort of look at it and say it needs to be fixed or something needs to change is after the body count gets so high.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would say, so one quick interpretive note for folks who maybe don't have a statistics background, the United States is huge. It's gigantic. Yeah. There's like 330 million people living here. So all the national statistics that you see me doing in my piece or anyone else's piece, you got to appreciate that this is actually pretty lumpy. So, like, just to your point, we see a certain accentuation of the worst features of being poor in black communities, poor black communities. But there's areas of the country where the only poor people to oppress are mostly white. And in those places, those poor whites, they're the ones who will fill the prisons or get over policed. This is really something that's true about poverty. And there's areas of the country where, yeah, you're going to have mostly poor whites are the ones being crushed. There's other places where the main minority around is indigenous Americans. So this is Wisconsin, for example, is, I lived in Minneapolis for 11 years, and Wisconsin is a primary example of that. When I would travel over there and do stand-up, there weren't like poor Latinos or poor black people. Generally, as I found in the Midwest, most of the sort of migrant black people that would move into a place in Wisconsin or whatever, they generally were more entrepreneurial, own their own business or whatever, and were pretty well off. Business owners have better rates and land is cheaper there. So
yeah, it was almost like, listen, I lived in the South in New Orleans or in Tennessee, Nashville area, and I saw that I could buy a bar in Wisconsin for a year's salary of what I was making at my job. And so I decided to move to small town Wisconsin, buy the primary bar and grill in town, and then run it. And then they end up becoming, like Black Jim, who owns the bar, right, or whatever in that area. But most of the poor people in that bar that are working those blue collar jobs and stuff are Native Americans, not Latino, Puerto Rican, Black, whatever.
And this gets into so that is just a way of acknowledging the value of a class framework. Certain things become true about your life at each income level with very little regard to race. There's just certain things that are going to be true about your life if you're a family of four living below the poverty threshold, which is about $26,000 a year. If you're living on less than that, there's just things that are true about your life that are going to be true whether you're in Wisconsin or New Jersey or Florida or in California. So getting back to your original question, the fastest way to describe it is that I was mostly a point-by-point stereotype of the most famous forms of oppression for the Black poor. I'm biracial. My mom was white trash poor. My dad was ghetto poor.
Were your parents divorced when you were a kid, or at a young
Never
age?
together.
Never together. Yeah. So
Yeah,
you grew up in a two household family.
Not even that.
Okay.
Yeah, at about 3 months old. So my dad had been a drug enforcer throughout the 80s. My mom partied very heavily. We lived with this guy. I believe his name was Tony. He sounds like a caricature from like an AMC series, but he was a drug dealer who was paralyzed from the waist down, mostly dealt meth, which was my mom and my dad's preferred drug. So my dad mostly spent his time beating the shit out of people who owed Tony money and then partying on meth, and my mom just partied on meth. My dad gets in an argument out Pemberton Way, which you may be familiar with just from Philadelphia. But if you're not familiar, it's just a rural, impoverished zone in South Jersey. Gets in an argument with an ex while he's on meth, ends up killing her in that argument. And so about 3 months after I was born, he gets incarcerated in Northern State Penitentiary. Never paroled because my dad continued gang affiliation while he was in there. He's a bit of, it was just, you have a few options in prison. You can try and get out early, but that means being on your best behavior and making yourself susceptible to abuse. My dad is a psychopath, so he took the option of being the worst incarnation of himself the entire time he was there. So he maxed out his sentence, so he doesn't get out until he does the full 16 years. Probably for the best, because he's still not a good person. My mom, she was trying to get her life together. She manages to do that well enough, and we kicked the substance abuse for a little while. And then around the time I'm 5, she gets involved with a more stable Black guy who had like a small insurance agency. And then there's just a stretch of years where it's like when they're together, I get to live in a nicer house, but I still have like an impoverished, traumatized mother who handles things the way that poor people do, where like we could be on the way to Red Lobster and an argument turns into her opening the door and saying she's going to throw herself out of the car if he doesn't turn the fuck around. And I'm in the back, so used to this, where I'm just thinking like, but we're getting those Cheddar Bay biscuits. Like, this is normal to me. So
it's amazing how when you come from poverty, you can compartmentalize even some of those most heinous memories or things, because the end goal is to not experience poverty for a night or a weekend or whatever it might be.
The feast and famine mode, where it's like you blow whatever money you get on Christmas because you don't know what the next good time is going to be.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I do think I've never really, I guess I kind of understood, like I understand it predominantly with food. Like I grew up in a house where my parents just didn't keep food in the house. Like we would go out to eat, and then there would be like the groceries we would stock would just be like frozen stuff, like Hot Pockets or whatever. Yeah. And so we literally went through feast and famine, where if like my parents, my dad and my stepmom were home and we're going to eat, we would all go out to dinner. But if they were out doing their own thing, it was like fend for yourself. And so the one thing, like when I got on my own, and I've been on my own since I was like 17, 18, was like I spend money on food, whether it's groceries or going out or whatever. Like this idea of like you're not going to have food when you want it is the last thing I ever go without. And obviously that plays into so many other aspects of my life. But when it comes to spending money you make, it's sort of, I do sort of have this mentality of like, well, I grew up going long stretches of time without having it. And so when I get it, it's almost like more beneficial to, and I should say predominantly when I was in my 20s, it was more beneficial to go out and experience spending it than to try to plant seeds to grow for the future and never, ever have to look back. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's almost like, that's a way where poverty almost has this sort of long-term traumatic effect on you, where you sort of have this impulse control problem then when you have things that could be gateways out of poverty, where you're like, I'm going to go on vacation to Vegas, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to spend money on this. And it's not necessarily a good financial investment because, it's almost like this weird thing of like, your future's never guaranteed, so why plan for it?
Yeah. And I think food is a great set because this is, you're getting old when you start saying like, what they should be teaching in high school is, but what they should be teaching in high school is at least one moment where they talk about some demographic terms that you're going to hear the rest of your life every time politics comes through. Because most of us get through high school and even college without even really knowing what poor refers to.
Right.
We just have a general idea, and we also use it as an adjective. We will say one person is poorer than another person, and it's like, yeah. But that's a relative comparison. It doesn't really tell you what poor is. So I always find it really helpful to let people know that the federal government definitions of poverty, all the poverty statistics you see cited in the New York Times or any of these places, they're talking about an amount of money that you would need on average to afford all of your biological necessities at once. So the amount of food you need to be able to purchase to be nutritioned without like a vitamin deficiency, how much to afford housing, clothing, the necessities. You start getting called poor when you have $1 less than you need to provide for all of them, because as most of us know, landlords don't haggle. So if you're $1 less, then you need to pick what you're not getting. And your body is slowly degrading because these are biological necessities. So the food is massive. Housing is massive. That's what poverty is. Even though we can use it to say like somebody in the middle class is poorer than somebody in the upper class.
Right.
Or every time you hear it in a government or academic context, we're looking at the people who have less than they need to fulfill their biological necessities. And it's really important to remember that most of us who are poor are born into it. So it's like the economy and all these other things or all these academic initiatives or any of that, that's not going to be really available to us until we've made it through the gauntlet of age 0 to 18, where we're not able to get ourselves out of poverty and you just suffer whatever trauma comes from never being fed or never being fully housed or clothed. And then if that hasn't fucked you up by 18, here's all the things you could do to get your act together.
To get yourself out of it, and unless you're talking about those rare circumstances of, some kid getting emancipated or having some insane talent that pulls them away from their family and out of that. And a lot of times then they're carrying the weight of their entire family with them. So young athletes or child actors.
Michael has an amazing joke on that where he's talking about, he has to explain to his accountant that being the only nigga who made it out of the hood is an expense.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's amazing how people just sort of come out of the woodwork, And for me, that journey was sort of like, it was so quick in terms of being in the public eye and having perceived wealth, because even though the TV show I hosted didn't have transformational wealth attached, the perception of people from the outside is like, this guy's on TV. He must be a millionaire. Yeah, he's got millions of dollars. And then when they find out that's not true, and then the sort of the fame goes away, the show ends or whatever, and you go on and do your own thing, there's almost like this resentment towards you because they didn't get pulled along in the pocket, you know what I mean? Or they sort of feel like you fumbled the ball for all of us, right? So it's sort of like, it's like that NFL draft pick who bounces out of the league after being a first round pick. And then he's not only got to deal with the disappointment of that, but he's got to deal with the resentment from everyone around him because he was supposed to be their meal ticket too.
Yeah. Something that, and there's a good thing to express there, and it sounds like maybe you had this experience a little bit, but it's like, so something to frame this, and the reason, part of why I have so much empathy towards people who are born poor is kind of this standard that I have where it's like, I think it's reasonable to expect people to be able to accomplish things that most humans can do. For example, I lived in poverty. Even if you were to imagine for a moment that all of the violent crime done in the country was only done by the poor, you would still end up in a situation where most of the poor never engaged in it. So like my mom was violently abused by her boyfriend. We were all poor. Most poor people don't engage in violent abuse of their partners or their children.
Right.
And so I don't really forgive him or make excuses for him given his circumstances.
That's an interesting perspective to sort of reject that victim mentality notion, because that's a very popular thing. This idea that poverty sort of excuses that behavior. You hear that a lot when people sort of argue, when they talk about trying to change poverty in a certain community or in a particular subset. They're always talking about it sort of being the way to end those things. And it's interesting to hear somebody with a perspective of those things don't really necessarily happen as a direct byproduct of poverty, because there are so many people in poverty that choose not to engage in that either.
Yeah, I'm very amenable to going at this from like a very psychological or neurobiological route if somebody wanted to. And I'm willing to admit that, like, quite possibly my mom's boyfriend, had he been exposed to nicer things, he never would have gone down that path. Mm-hmm. I'm open to that. At the same time, again, most poor people don't respond to poverty that way. And
well,
so
there's also like a real life, like more of a real life applicable explanation for why the impoverished or people in poverty find themselves in sort of that pattern of violence more frequently. And it could be as simple as something as like, when people talk about it generationally, it's like, well, you're talking about kids who basically, because of poverty, were probably beat up a lot. But what they don't understand is, like, if there's traumatic brain damage or traumatic brain injury as a result of that, it can actually affect your receptors or your empathy or your ability to, like.
And we do hear about that, people getting traumatic brain injuries.
Right.
And then,
yeah. So it's like, I wonder how many of our parents literally have had concussion damage or CTE damage from the physical abuse experienced by their parents, who experienced it from their parents. And it's like, you're literally talking about, it's not that it's genetic, and it's not that it's the poverty is the through line, but it's literally about the physical violence that leads to long-term brain impact, then can result in further physical violence. And the only experience I have with this is I've had some pretty bad concussions over my lifetime, and I had a really, really bad one in spring of 2019. Yeah, 2018. So after my first internet cancellation or whatever, I was working later that summer, in summer of 2018, and I hit my head on the aluminum trunk door of my SUV and like blacked out for a second. I didn't go out entirely, but I had like really bad post-traumatic or post-concussion syndrome after that, where like I was sleeping for long hours. I couldn't see right. But the other thing was irritability. And I found myself having difficulty, not reacting violently to little things, like little triggers. And it wasn't until my girlfriend pointed out, she's like, you've got a real short fuse since this last concussion, and you got to figure out something you can take or whatever that you can do to kind of counterbalance that, because your ability to push your rage down is not as good as it used to be. And it probably took me 6 months to a year of recovering from that last concussion to notice I'm becoming more patient again, and my fuse is longer, and I'm not reacting with such rage to like little incidents and things like that. So I just think about, like, when I was a kid, what a hair trigger response my father would have to little things and react in this sort of violent rage. And I'm like, he grew up playing football without helmets, dude. So it's like our parents, it's like, it's not necessarily that they are poor and that poor people it's just that poor people do a lot of dangerous shit to make money and survive. And there's a lot of physical injury, and I think a lot of actual physical brain trauma they incur leading a rougher lifestyle. Like a dude who's a drug enforcement or enforcer probably got his ass kicked as much as he kicked people's asses over the years, and that leads to a real life brain impact.
Yeah, his mom had punched him in the face before. Or if anyone really wants to go through some hearts, it's like, pull up DMX and actually read through his childhood. It's
it's brutal.
Yeah, it's
brutal. And then it's like you hear these stories, like the sexy CTE stories are professional athletes or professional wrestlers who kill their whole family and then themselves. There are probably a lot of guys who just worked in the trades, construction, mechanics, who are dealing with the same levels of CTE. And then you trickle on alcoholism and drug addiction on top of it. It's a cocktail for disaster.
Yeah. Well, if you ever decide to write, I don't know how many things have been looking specifically at that line. Pivoting slightly from there, all of those things.
I was going to say, to loop us back through, that's where I think a lot of times as an artist and as a creative, I reject a lot of the ideas just naturally. People think it's just me being a natural contrarian, but it's like I reject a lot of these things being systemic because I think there are real tangible things that affect individuals that then can be painted or look systemic, but it's really like, well, a lot of these people just happen by nature of the lives they live to experience a lot of the same tangible physical things. Like, it's sort of like an interesting examination, and what you proposed earlier is like, poverty doesn't necessarily directly correlate to more interactions with the police. However, when you talk about violence, then that potentially leads to more interactions with the police. And even though that's not a majority of people in poverty, a majority of the people who have those interactions are also in poverty. So it's like, its causation doesn't necessarily equal correlation, but they're almost always living in the same neighborhood.
Yeah, I would say this is why it's important to remember just how large the U.S. is and how most of these statistics are aggregates, and that if you actually look city by city or rural locale by locale, there's these little differences. Because one thing there is once a town or a state decides to have a police department, and I completely understand why you have a police department, but once you have it, like any other human organization, you got to use it. And the people who are hired there need some way of justifying their existence. And most of us, it's like the part of the legal system that we don't often talk about is we can't actually enforce every rule and every protection that we actually have. So a lot of your ability to navigate the system depends on you having money for a lawyer or legal representation who can make sure that your your rights, even if they're written on the books, you need someone to do that enforcement and that preservation for you. And a lot of times, whether you're a poor indigenous community, a poor white community, a poor black community, if your area is the one that's been chosen for the over-policing and for the justification for having the police department, even if we already have laws on the books or a certain cultural way of thinking where that's not good, you can't afford the defense available to you. You can't afford the lawyer who could protect you from these encroachments. So our justice
system is built where you require advocacy. Just because something is legally your right, that's not enough. You need somebody to go advocate for you and to be educated and know what your rights are and the circumstances and argue in your defense. So just the structure of our legal system to begin with will create these barriers of if you can't go out and get the proper advocate, then it doesn't matter what the law is.
Most poor kids that I know have at some point had an experience where they got to be friends with somebody from a different class, and you got to see a very simple, let's say, teenager mishap happen where friends in two different classes both get a DUI, and you get to see completely different results based on who was able to afford a lawyer and who wasn't.
Oh, of course. And you hear this all the time sort of get painted as white privilege, but it really boils down to class and economics, right? I mean, the rich kids in your school, regardless of color, and I think we'll see this change, by the way, over the years, but an interesting thing in my class that I graduated from in Minnesota, the only two black kids in our class were adopted by some of the wealthiest white people in our neighborhood. So the class experience for our black classmates was hardly what I think somebody from the outside looking in, not knowing the socioeconomics of their situation, they could very easily just make a racist determination of they know about struggle that no one else knows about. And it's not necessarily. They were adopted as babies and raised basically upper white class. And so
that is a good segue to the piece. So one of the things that I want to say, so we've been listing all these things that are common in poverty. Taking it to a human scale, when you look at the income levels, most of the time the U.S. is divided this is just standard for economists, you divide it into 5 quintiles, which just means each 20% block, with the bottom being like people making typically like less than 30,000. Then you have people making say like 30 to 40, 40,000. And then you have people who are going to be like your solid middle, where it's like 40 to, or maybe like 45 to like something under like 75 will be your middle, so on and so forth, until you get to like the top 20%, where people are like at the over $150,000 or $170,000 household mark. So you need either an excess of a marketable skill. That might be your academic acumen, cognitive ability. It might be your charisma. It might be that you're really funny. It might be that you're a great athlete. You either need so much of that on a long enough time scale, the economy is like, there's a place for you. You just have to survive. Mm-hmm. Or you need a certain, I'll call it behavioral perfection, to jump classes. Since the 1950s, half of us, regardless of race, really don't do much better than our parents. But what I want to drive home here is that to move from the middle class, being born in the middle class, to the upper class, so jumping 2 of these quintiles, 2 of these tiers, going from like being solidly middle to someone who's in the top 20% of income earners in the US, only about 15% of Americans do that. It's very uncommon for any human to be able to jump 2 of these tiers. Mm-hmm. For those born in the bottom of poverty, same situation. You have to jump 2 tiers to get to solidly middle. Almost never happens. And I like returning to this frame because in the middle class, and I'm saying this as somebody who's moved from like cracked end poverty into the middle, into what is now like possibly on the upper middle to
top 40%, right? Yeah. Crossing into the top 40%.
My life is extremely comfortable. I can compare the two, and nothing that occurs to me in the course of any average day since I broke into the middle class resembles poverty. Nothing does. And if people born in this area also struggle to jump 2 classes, the idea of going to what we were just describing, with all the trauma, the starvation, the denial of biological necessities, and being the person who can't afford to pick up, to defend yourself, even when the legal word says that there is a defense for you, you just have to pay for someone to enforce it.
Right.
If the person more comfortable probably won't make it 2 classes or 2 income tiers, to me, it just follows, and not everyone will accept this. I don't expect it to be common for the poor to be able to do it either.
Right. That's a very good point. Before we get too far into getting into the article specifically, tell me a little bit about your journey through academia. Like, at what point, and not to say this is necessarily the stance that you held in writing the story, but where was the first point in moving through academia that you started to reject, or maybe just have sort of a different perspective than what was sort of being talked about or regurgitated? Like, where did you feel yourself having some initial divergence to like, well, this is what it means to come from poverty, and this is how you fix it? Because obviously the perspective that you share in this article is not necessarily one that I think is a popularly held perspective, particularly with people that advocate for increasing diversity, increasing inclusion, increasing some of these things that are desirable improvement areas. But your perspective on it is one that's clearly divergent from absolutely from academia, and definitely from what I would consider like liberal Hollywood. So where did you start to run? Like, what was the first moment for you, whether through academia or just as an individual, where you started to go, this problem isn't being solved the right way, or this problem isn't even being diagnosed properly?
Yeah, that's really easy to do. And I just I'll step out of my lane just for a second, because there's a tendency when you're talking about Black America to really, there's like a separate set of rules and perceptions that apply here, but that we don't apply elsewhere. Every researcher, every person in academia, and really most people doing anything creative, you're a human first, and your experiences are very loud in your head, and they inform much of what you do. So stepping out of my experience just for a second, the moment women are allowed into experimental psychology, it's going to be so painfully obvious to them just by virtue of their bodies that, a lot of these studies don't actually include women. I'm not sure if you can diagnose the truth of the human condition if you cut out like half the people experiencing it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's without diving into the specificity, you would think that would make sense for everything.
Yeah. Takes no, I'm sure many of the women who did end up writing about this were brilliant, but it doesn't take any special brilliance to notice when you're being left out. Just doesn't. You just roll into a place and you can tell. I got to graduate school in 2014. I was still impoverished at the time. I'm coming around the time of the second wave of protests in Ferguson. I'm in an education program for education theory and policy. So not only is there this climate that is encouraging us to focus on statistics having to do with race, to focus on education and its role in increasing upward mobility, because there's so much focus right now in this really poor area of the country. But how do I put it? I think I lost the third, but there were those two things going on. So I'm in these graduate school classes. Oh, and education. The third thing was education skews liberal. Most
always.
Most and this is without like any particular judgment. I wouldn't try and diagnose the psychology of people's choices from like their college major, but there's just generally a pool in things that are human concerned, like where it's directly you're working with humans. Towards liberal stances, I was in an education program. It has that stance. So all these things combined to mean that I was in this seminar.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the unionization aspect of academia as well. Like, there is sort of, because it's such a strong union industry, there is this sense of like things can only be done when there's ideological collectivism. And so when you look at that, and I talk about this all the time, like there are byproducts, good or bad, of a political or sociological ideology. So like, obviously the benefit to liberalism or collectivism in my mind is that there is a lot more desire to collaborate. And there is a lot more sort of desire to put numbers behind an ideology or a perspective or a group. That's why you see on the left, there's so many of these, there's so much organization, right? So things very quickly become groups, GLAAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And now in the last few years, BLM, Antifa, these types of things. But then when you look on the right, there's almost this, some of the crux of the right is that so much of the ideology is based in individualism. And so what those folks never tend to do is seek collaboration, build strength in numbers. And so you have a lot of people firing in their own unique different directions. So that's what's kind of funny is, as a guy who considers himself in the middle, although is often perceived as being on the right, I look at the biggest problem on the right is that they have an inability to get their shit together or unify under one common message or leadership. And it's so divergent. It's almost like militias versus a well-organized army. And so the part of the problem on that side is the ideology itself, is that being sort of a radical individualist, you're not going to get a lot moving in the right direction because everybody starts to break away and have their own idea of what right looks like. And so instead of having a conservative Twitter, you have 70 conservative Twitters, and none of them are effective because everybody has this nuanced approach to how things get done. So, my concern about policy in terms of driving America forward is really like there are great ideas from both sides that will eventually need to be blended together to accomplish what we want these things to accomplish. And partisanship will never allow that to happen. So like a good example, when you talk about those 5 chambers of economics, right? People in the top 20, bottom 20, and you've got that middle 60. I actually think having a socialized approach of UBI for the bottom 20, removing income tax from the middle 60 and applying it to the high 20, and then adding a consumption tax to the top 40 would be the way to fix our economy altogether, right? Problem is, you'll never get the left to agree to the thing on the top end. you'll never get the right to agree to the thing on the bottom end. And really, it's a blend of all those ideas socioeconomically that would probably give people in that bottom 20 a path to get to the top 40. However, because of partisanship, that kind of hybrid economic system would never happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have an underwhelming response, which is just, yeah, I find, so I'm not strongly beholden to political ideologies or labels. I'm kind of like I'm an end goal focused person. So if somebody can give me a plan for improving, as you just did, if they can give me a plan and lay out all the details that would basically improve the situation for the poor. And for me, improving the situation is like, I've never seen anyone actually do the math or the numbers to be like, what's the maximum amount of millionaires we can have before it's just all being sucked up. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but for me, it's just like, in theory, without knowing the rest, I'm not personally concerned with some people having less income than other people. I'm mostly concerned with, if you do have low income, I would like the things that are non-negotiable for you to be the biological necessities. Like maybe you can't afford the newest car, or you can't afford iPhone, or your kids can't go to an elite private school, or you can't get tutoring, or you're not going to be going on a vacation a month, or even like 4 vacations a year. And
or maybe one every decade.
Yeah. And I'm totally open to all the existentialist philosophy about how, like, even when you're well provided for and you're at the top of Maslow's hierarchy, you can just be suffering horrible depression and ennui. Open to all of that.
Yeah.
I just want.
I'm not. I don't believe it. I don't buy it. Maybe I'll change my mind if I ever get there. But
well, by open, I mean like I'll listen to whoever wants to make the case. But for me, anyone who wants to propose a system that would mean people born into the low income category still have their biological necessities covered. Cool. I'll listen to you. I don't really care what political label or ideology brought you to this decision. I just want to know, are you going to be able to make sure that people born into the lower income tier have adequate housing without cockroaches or like, asbestos and lead? Can you be guaranteed food? Can you get all these other things? After that, and maybe this is just because of like how deeply American cultured I am. After that, you start looking at the forms of oppression and injustice that I can recognize philosophically as injustice or unfair. They just don't move me the way starvation,
they do at the bottom end.
Yeah. So
because those are non-starters, right? Like the other things can sort of be dressed up or dealt with circumstantially, but when you are dealing with starvation, housing issues, whatever, I mean, those are non-starters. Everything else becomes very minuscule by comparison.
Yeah. For me, it's like there's a lot of things that are written about an equal amount to starvation, child poverty, inadequate, schools. I would say like cultural criticism, like pop cultural criticism, takes up an equal amount of space. But I'm just not that moved that much. By what's going on in movies.
As a comedian, I so much agree. And as a comedian, it's very common for me to point this out and say, like, really, activism in any sort of frame is a byproduct of privilege. Like, and I give comedian Whitney Cummings a lot of shit. I've done it publicly and I've done it privately as well. Of just like
you've spoken to her.
Yeah. I've done shows with Whitney, and I'll make a remark about like, boy, I wish I had enough money to where I could give a fuck about animals. She's such a pro animal activist. And, like when the fires happened, she was like driving all over the valley trying to save all these rare animals and I was just like, that's somebody who has never had to worry about, like, did I pay all the electric bill this month or last month? You know what I mean? So like those situations to me is like so many of the things where I find people kind of wade in the weeds is like, you even to be able to pay that any sort of emotional attention whatsoever in your day is a byproduct of sort of your circumstances of privilege, right? Of like to not have to worry about where the next meal is coming from and focus on anything that's beyond that is you're already starting to wade into a territory of upper middle class privilege.
And for me, the only adjustment, I don't know Whitney Cummings at all. Like I know of her, I know her shows. I've never met her, and I don't know that I will. But I would say the only adjustment, hypothetically, from what you said that I would want is like, if she has the money and the time, I'm still glad that she's going out there trying to save the animals.
Absolutely, sure.
When she's
and that is her freedom of choice, by the way. Yeah, she's totally free to waste her money however she wants. But
when she's evaluating other people's behavior or whatever story she tells, I would like her to include in that story that some people, depending on their situation, may not be in a position to think about rare animals first. So
right, exactly, exactly. And it is having that. It's sort of like an understanding of downward empathy and understanding when there isn't any upwards empathy. And so it brings us to the crux of how we started speaking was because of the Dave Chappelle thing. And one of the things that I've really tried to push and help people understand is like you have to realize that the reason that your empathy expectations aren't being met is because there is a fundamental disagreement on who is up and who is down in that equation. Mm-hmm. And it depends on which side of the equation you are in. So my perspective is that Dave is trying to say, I feel like I'm punching up because there are many ways where I feel like your side is experiencing things that are in a range where I have an inability to push my empathy upwards towards you and understand your struggle because I feel like ours are still very much at the ground level. And on the opposite side, the trans and gay community as well feel the opposite way. And so whereas you're seeing Dave sort of argue this perspective of, I just can't care about gay and trans issues because there are still so many problems in Black America, people that are on the other side of the aisle feel exactly the same way. But the difficulty comes in how it's communicated. And of course, Dave being a comedian and being sort of signature Dave Chappelle has his way of doing it. And maybe someday there'll be a trans comedian or a gay comedian who comes out on the other side and presents a similar argument going the other direction. I don't think that'll happen because I think that's a very, very hard thing to tackle. I can tell you as a white comedian, anytime you try to be critical of any groups that are perceived beneath you. And this is the problem I have with the concept of punching up or punching down is it inherently has to begin with a belief of hierarchy, which I don't have. I don't have this belief that as a white person, I'm above certain groups. Therefore, I don't have this idea of punching up or punching down in my art that would necessarily placate some of these presumptions. And so you seem like you want to jump in there. I want to let you give you the opportunity to jump in.
So I never got to write this because it was back during the time where no one was letting me write anything. But Dave Chappelle during the last firestorm, and some people may have seen that recent tweet that I did just referencing him a little bit, but it's because I was thinking of him and stand up very heavily back in 2018 when he had the last flare up that really kind of just passed.
From Sticks and Stones.
Yeah, from Sticks and Stones. The concept of punching up and punching down, I think, in comedy is also, it's nestled in a very particular approach to art and thinking about art, which is that art, because it can influence people, should be intrinsically politically minded.
Yeah.
So because there are hierarchies in society, at least in terms of there are people who, at base, we can at least agree there are people who are born with the more access to power, whether that comes through social prestige or currency or connections. There's people who get more, there's people who have less. For the people who have this sensibility that art should intrinsically be politically minded, you should only be punching up. You should only be punching up because the people with less power in the hierarchy really don't need one more negative thing happening to them. Chappelle, even though he himself is middle class, is coming from the Black comedic tradition, which really influences, if you've wanted to be a stand-up pretty much for the last 50 years, you were in some way influenced by somebody in that line, from like Red Fox to Richard Pryor to Eddie Murphy to Chris Rock. And then when it really opens up in the 90s and you can have multiple top selling black comedians in that culture, comedy, like, so I should add, in that culture, most of those black comedians who got really famous are coming from poverty. They're not like Dave Chappelle, who's coming from middle class. And it's the same type of black poverty that spawned, say, battle rap in this really confrontational style. Yeah. And you're mostly fighting other people that live on the same, fighting other people who are all on the same block as you. Mm-hmm. So you're all in the same situation. You're inherently making fun of other people who are also marginalized and impoverished. And the role of comedy in that situation is not intrinsically political. It's mostly to laugh. That's kind of its whole goal, is to laugh. It doesn't have any other ulterior motive. And these are really different ways of looking at the role of stand-up, because there's no concept of punching up or down in the areas where like black stand-up was really perfected. It's just not a thing. It's not the purpose. As stand-up has become like kind of millennial and Gen Z fixation, something you can do when you have, it's pretty easy to buy a comedy show, Netflix, or buy tickets to a comedy show. Netflix is pumping out the stand-up specials. If they have brought their own lens to it, they bring that focus that art must be intrinsically political and minded to this. And that's just something that I wanted to explore, because it's like, yeah, if you're in a circle of black people in poverty cracking jokes, the goal is to say something so vicious and so merciless that you leave the other person either stunned or like they just leave. And that's when you've won. It's the same concept as a rap battle. That's how you're brought up in it. That's the whole focus. And it's just like, when I see the criticisms coming towards Dave Chappelle, if we had a really active class lens, we would see this as two different class perspectives on the role of stand-up and language. But without that, we just see this old black regressive who's become rich, who doesn't want to change his jokes. And I haven't watched his most recent special, but I know from 2008, if this is anything like that, there's nuances here that are relevant to me coming from the poor black class.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I grew up with the same experience, watching Def Jam and Comic View, and that was a lot of my exposure to stand up early on, was to black stand up. And I grew up in a predominantly, I'd say probably predominantly mixed, definitely our largest minority group, where I grew up in Philadelphia and just outside of the city. Our only minority group were African Americans, were black people. And so, and it was pretty 50-50, it felt, where I grew up. So there was never sort of this idea of like, this is a minority perspective. It was just sort of like, this is comedy. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the people that are in the space commenting on Chappelle now and talking about like what is or isn't okay about what he does are only familiar with him from his recent stuff, maybe going back to 16. And so they forget about Half-Baked Dave Chappelle. They forget about Def Jam Dave Chappelle. They forget about Comic View Dave Chappelle. And so this idea that you can make great points like he did in, 846, which was the small thing he did on George Floyd on Instagram. He can also just be silly and not be intending to make a point whatsoever. And I do think, he's not saying in his new special that black people are beneath the LGBTQ movement. He's saying our perspective in mass, or a perspective, is that we are. And so you have to respect that many black people will not give a shit about your struggle, just as we have to respect that many of you won't give a shit about our struggle. It's all really based on whatever your individual life perspective is and whatever causes it. And that's really where I thought, I imagine that's why Roxanne shared this with me and pointed me at you, Bert, and said, hey, here's somebody who's writing about the idea that race doesn't automatically dictate perspective. And in reality and in practice, there is a lot of individuals in Hollywood or pop culture particularly who create and are often credited for checking that box of giving us the Black perspective. And it's interesting when you start to dive in that it's not necessarily the entire Black perspective. And in many cases, a lot of what people want to see communicated through pop culture about the Black experience is left out because of who's chosen.
So getting back to a question that you asked me earlier, I'm sitting in this graduate school class focused on education at the height of when people want to talk about every form of oppression that can be captured statistically. This is like when mass incarceration is really taking off as a topic. And I'm being told statistics that every liberal has already accepted as true. This is just base stuff. For example, only 1 out of every 10 low-income high school students graduates from college, 4-year college. Accepted as fact. We're studying it in the class. We're all agreeing to it. And then I would notice that, I'm going to school in North Jersey. It's fairly mixed, even though this is a class of, say, like 12 to 15 students.
Where did you go? Did you go to?
I went to Rutgers.
Rutgers. Okay, cool. So if I would have went to college on the East Coast, that's where I would have went. I'm a huge Rutgers fan, and I wanted to go there, but I didn't play football. I played ice hockey. And so when it came time to start looking at trying to get into college to do hockey, the choice was to try to pursue it on the East Coast. And really, your choices then academically become like, and this is, keep in mind, I graduated in 2001. So my choices were like for hockey, Princeton, right? Academically not very easy to get in. Harvard.
I've heard that.
So like a lot of your good hockey schools on the East Coast have really, really tough academic requirements. And at the time, there weren't a lot of players who played for those clubs who ended up going into the NHL. So I moved to Minnesota, where my mom lived, with hopes of playing for one of the big power Big Ten schools like Michigan or Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then ended up getting hurt and not continuing to play, and then got into music and so my whole life kind of took a different path than planned, but always been a big Rutgers fan, and so it's kind of cool that you got to go there.
It was a great school. It was a great program for education, Rutgers, GSE. So if people can imagine being me for a moment, I'm coming from poverty. I've grown up in the 90s watching, all these shows that not just black shows, but also white shows, where everything has a class lens. Simpsons has a class lens, Roseanne, Married with Children, and then many of the black shows.
Martin, Sister.
Living Single. Like, not only is there multiple classes in these shows, there's also class conflict. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
Yeah, good example. Yeah.
Understand class, you don't understand why Carlton is funny. You don't get it.
Right.
And everybody understood why Carlton was funny because there is some innate understanding.
And that's why Carlton became an insult.
Yeah.
Like when black people wanted to rip on nerdy black people, they would call them Carlton, right? Like that became an insult. Like all my black friends would call their black friends when they wanted to insult them for doing something they thought was bougie or out of class, they would call them Carlton. Yeah.
Carlton and Hillary, we know why.
Hillary is the other one too. By the way, I loved Hillary as a kid. Like she was, while a lot of the kids growing up were like attracted to, maybe one of the girls from Full House or one of those. Like I grew up being like, I fuck with Hillary.
Yeah, and if you watch Major Payne, that'll do that for you.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting in this class with all this experiential knowledge, and I'm being told only 1 out of every 10 students, high school students who grew up like me, is going to make it to a bachelor's program. Now, mind you, I'm in a graduate school program, so I made it to the next place. So when I hear the black students, the other 3 or 4 in this class, it's like, I already know without having a degree in mathematics that it is probabilistically impossible for all 4 of us to be the black person from poverty. It just cannot be. Not if these other things we've accepted as true are true. Not unless not unless secretly all these poor high schoolers have been graduating with bachelor's degrees, and we just haven't been capturing it in the National Center for Education Statistics. So
yeah, it's like when you find yourself sitting in a room with 10 other people, and then you start to realize, like, statistically, 3 of these people have herpes.
Similar.
It's not something we often stop to think about when you think about applying statistics, right? We try to avoid those circumstances when it's not a good thing.
But that's such a big part of what I was trying to write, is like, it's one thing to look at a statistic and just be like, oh, I've learned something new. It's another to be like, actually make this a part of your imagination. And I think the room is a great unit for that. When you're sitting in a room, imagine what those statistics you accept mean for that room. And so this is also around the time of the opioid crisis, or it's getting at the point where it's going to be called that, publicly all the time. And I'm listening to white students talk about opioid crises in these various poor white communities. But because in white America, it is common to have a very clear understanding of class, and that if you're a white person in graduate school, it's pretty much assumed that you're solidly middle or better. When they would say these statistics, they had a sense that they were of a different class than the white people who were suffering these things in poor communities. And they talked about the problem at that distance. When the Black students would mention incarceration or police violence or any of these things, they only used first person pronouns. It was, what we have been going through, me, my, our community, my people, things like that.
So you recognize that race played a role in people's ability to separate themselves by class between the white and Black students.
It separated both, and it represented both an ability to do it and the expectation as to whether or not you would. Because sometimes this was very immature, but sometimes I would get frustrated at somebody dropping one of those statistics. And just to, make sure the audience understands, you've probably heard about mass incarceration as, say, like a Black problem or a problem in Black communities. If you go to any of the websites that are interested in policy initiative for prisons and advocacy for prisoners, something around 8 or more out of every Black prisoners came from poverty. So if we have these 3 major class categories, poor, middle, and upper class, we're saying 80% of all of the Black prisoners are being pulled out of just one of those classes. The other 2 classes combined contribute just 2 of those prisoners. Yet we describe this as a Black problem. That's a very specific choice, and it was one that I didn't necessarily love when I was in these classes. So I'd hear someone drop a statistic like that and then segue into their opinion on what Black thought was. And sometimes I would know that in my particular, and we can bring regions into this, in my particular experience of Northeastern Black poverty, they would be wrong. And I knew what credentialing was, and we can get into that in a second, but I would know that as I'm watching the Black kid, basically given the floor to speak for the Black poor using all these first person pronouns, and all of these white students who are liberal and many of them are not being cynical. They have a good degree of empathy. They're nodding along because they want to be supportive here. I jump in, and not only do I disagree with what that Black student said, but much like I did in my article, I state my actual relationship to these statistics. My father in prison, being from poverty, living in a crack den. And the room would grow suddenly quiet. And what I had stumbled upon was this. Those Black students, there are arguments to disagree with the points that I made in those classes, but they weren't used to having to make that argument. They were used to just getting deference based on being connected hypothetically to these poor experiences. And then on the white student side, they didn't know who to nod along with because, for lack of a better way of describing it, they had been hoping that there was so much singularity among Black thought, they could just pick a Black person and go along with it. And they weren't really thinking about how class works in America. They weren't realizing, like, oh, the same way that you're not connected to the white poor who are, dying from OxyContin because that you're in this privileged room, life has not worked out in such a way that this room is providing you with students from Black poverty. Those Black students don't come from there. And now I'm giving them 2 different opinions, and they don't know which Black person to nod along with. And so that was the moment that I realized that, like, there's just a way of thinking about these things, that statistics that we all agree to, like only 1 out of 10, don't penetrate because we know how to compartmentalize them and how to behave. And it's only when somebody like myself comes along, and as I've already mentioned, pretty rare to jump 2 classes, pretty rare to graduate coming from poverty. They don't stumble across me in most of these middle or upper class places. So they're used to basically all being able to play. I don't want to cheapen it, but I'm going to describe it as a game. They're used to being the only Black people in an otherwise middle and upper class white room and getting to represent all the Black people to that audience. And since all of them normally come from the middle and upper class, since they don't actually credential each other and say like, well, did you grow up in poverty? As long as they all agree to be vague about this point, it works. And the white audience just nods along. When I come along and I up the ante by actually saying not just that I grew up poor or low income, but I describe to you how light breaks through a window in a crack den, you have 2 options. You can either lie and try to like match me in some way by describing oppression that you experience in the middle or upper class, which any human who's not a fucking psychopath isn't going to choose.
Right, exactly.
Or you just have to kind of sit there and deal with the fact that this somebody from the group that you claim to care about is telling you that they disagree with how you're caring about them. And you're kind of just stuck.
I'm not going to ask if, but I'll ask when. When was the first time somebody tried to use your mixed race status as an excuse for why you were able to jump those 2 classes in the context of one of these conversations? Because I have to assume it's happened.
So there's an interesting answer there. Behind the scenes, it was probably happening from day one.
Okay.
In terms of people willing to say it to my face, didn't happen until I got on Twitter. Didn't happen until the last few months.
I can expect that. Yeah, for sure.
And this is a really interesting dynamic
where people would essentially say, well, the reason you were able to do that is because you're not all the way Black. See, that's even though I was raised by millionaires, I'm all the way Black. So that somehow gives me some sort of advantage, or it almost at the very least equalizes us. And me as an outside objective viewer would go, it absolutely does not. Right. Like to pretend that anyone's skin color affects their story or the legitimacy of it, to me, is like it's very short-sighted. It's like, I grew up in an environment, and I feel very, very blessed and fortunate for this, where I was constantly surrounded by people who contradicted the stereotypes of their race or of their gender. So I was not around weak women. I grew up around very strong, tough, physically imposing, mean women. Right. So this idea that women are this idea that women are these sort of perpetual dainty victims in every circumstance is not something I've ever digested, because I grew up in an environment where that just wasn't women. They all smoked, they all cursed, they all talk shit, they all work jobs in many cases that were traditionally for men. And the ones who broke out of that very blue collar space still maintained a lot of that swagger, that personality. Same thing with Black people. I did not grow up around Black people who fulfilled stereotypes. I grew up around Black people in many cases that broke the mold of stereotypes and jumped multiple classes or did these incredible things and accomplished great things despite what maybe their starting place was or any of that. So I always grew up with the default understanding is that people can always surprise you. And so I think intrinsically my contrarianism comes from this idea that like circumstances define us ever. And I believe I grew up watching so many situations where people always succeeded in spite of their circumstances because they just chose to. And not saying it wasn't hard or it wasn't difficult, but that definitely shaped my perspective to say, your circumstances, your starting place never determines where you have to end up. And I do recognize that because of that perspective, it makes me almost automatically dismissive of collectivism when people go, well, all this group struggles with this, or all of that group struggles with that. My immediate pushback is like, I can at least give you one example of somebody who rejected that or that did not affect. And so, I'm not saying that's right. That's just my life experience growing up.
So a few things to respond to there. And I think it is important for people to speak from their experience. I think there's a value judgment to be made here. If you across the board, because you know that some humans have accomplished extraordinary things, you think every human is thus responsible to do something extraordinary, like jumping 2 classes or being willing.
It's still choice, right? I still think there's an element of choice there where some people don't even aspire to do that. And those people should be able to survive and live a life that's meaningful to them as well.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying necessarily that you hold this belief. It's just like
I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
I do think a lot of people think it's black and white. Like, just because you believe that, I say this all the time. I don't believe that the dream of America is about equality. I believe it's about exceptionalism. That doesn't mean that everybody should be exceptional or has to be exceptional to participate. I believe exceptionalism should be rewarded, but it shouldn't be a requirement. Does that make sense?
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
As long as the thing that I sometimes have an issue with is that I don't at base have an issue with people believing that, let's say, something exceptional would be rewarded. I don't have that issue. I more have an issue when people imagine that all the people who aren't poor have accomplished something exceptional.
Yeah, very true.
When I look at the data, and I also, we have lots of little points like this, but it's like we can compare, unwanted pregnancies across classes. We can compare drug use across classes. And we find that across classes, there is pretty standard human behavior that if you don't have the money to take care of it, you will be punished. And if you do have the money to take care of it, you get a chance to live your 20s and grow from it and learn to do better in the future.
Well, it's such an interesting thing. Like before we jumped on today in my preparation, I was thinking about something and I thought is there a thing that ultimately defines if you come from means or privilege or not? And I was just thinking a real good example would be, let's imagine you were pulled over and arrested and accused of a crime you didn't commit, regardless of race or anything like that. Let's just say you fit the description, wrong place, wrong time, and you end up being jailed for something you didn't do. Does anyone in your immediate family have the money to come bail you out? And it's sort of to me, no, in no circumstance do I live in a situation where anyone in my family would have the money to come bail me out, regardless of what it was or my involvement. It could even be something very petty, but the answer is no. And so to me, I think often in these conversations, we should be finding those universal points to share in, to say, this isn't really a race thing. It's really an economic thing of if something happened to you, not of your own fault, do you even have connection to the means or advocacy to get yourself out of that situation immediately? And I'd say for many white people, the answer is yes, and they don't even think about it. They go well, yeah, if I needed $5,000, I could call my parents. That's nothing. But it's so interesting how, and for me, it's dude, if I call my parents, they're going to have to call everybody to get that $5,000
it would be a group
together.
Effort to get
it would be
out.
I think our uncle has a rich friend, and their rich friend, by the way, just owns 2 gas stations and might have 10 grand laying around. So it's such a weird, very weird thing. And I grew up around all white people that are like that, Italians, Jewish, Irish, who it was if somebody needs 10 grand, it's going to take a community effort to put that money together. And there are so many people where that's a phone call away in many, many circumstances. And it's that's where I start to feel separated from people regardless of race, right? Because I know by nature of living in Hollywood and being surrounded by a lot of people who started in the middle or the top 40 and are now in the top 20, we have a very different perspective. And so what frustrates me often is automatically, because I'm white and in Hollywood, people assume I'm in that top 20, probably in that top 40, absolutely in the top 60, and nobody believes I came from the bottom 20 or still exist in the bottom 40. And so that's a thing that I feel like as we go forward, we have to be cognizant that that doesn't become some default presumption about white people or biracial people, you know, where we just start to assume that their perspective is at the very least this good or better just based on the color of their skin.
So I agree with a lot of that. I'm a big fan of including all the nuance, but I'm going to be realistic about my expectations. My piece, and I don't like to brag, and anyone who read like my Michael R. Ware interview will know that I'm pretty avoidant of saying that I've done anything impressive ever in my life. But I do think I tried to capture a lot of nuance. I don't think that that's what won most people over, or even what kept some people who would like to detract from me silent. I really do think, and this is going to get into your comment about like my biracialness. When I was growing up in areas like the ones that you talk about in Philadelphia, there's an understanding. This is a generational difference, and Gen Z is, things are allowed to shift, but they have a different view. I grew up with generations and generations of Black people who had lived and had their lives determined by the one drop rule. So if I even seemed like I didn't recognize that I was Black, there was some older Black person who was like, you know, mixed just means you're a light-skinned nigga. It doesn't mean anything else.
Right, exactly.
Period.
Exactly. There was no, you didn't get any credit for that.
Yeah, and
even on the other side, like old school racist New York, New Jersey Italians, if you came home with their daughter, or you know, it would count no matter how little it was, right?
Yeah,
you know, and I come from an Irish family like that was very much like that growing up. So when I started dating ethnic women, it took them a while to sort of like, all right, like
be okay with it.
Yeah, and to some degree, I bet in many, like, I think also part of the reason is I don't intend to have any kids, but I think if I did, that conversation would probably rise up again and would become more of a discussion piece than it actually is.
So living in those being mixed, living in those areas, not only is the white one drop rule the sort of a long storied conception of Blackness in America until like 3 seconds ago, but our concept of Blackness was, there was a duality here. It was ancestry plus you're here. If your life was different than mine, you wouldn't be in this shit. The fact that you're here means that you're having the Black experiences, quote unquote.
Right.
Their definition is experiential. You're experiencing these things that are happening in part because of your ancestry. And I know they're happening to you because there's not a nice part of the shithole. So if you're here, we're doing this shit together.
Yeah.
Once I moved into areas, and I'll stick to that, again, that framing, that unit, that good place for imagination, for statistics. Once I started entering rooms full of Black people who have lived in nicer areas and mostly been about white people, their experience of Blackness, how they define Blackness is a different set of experiences. They're not being harassed by police to the degree that you do in the poor areas. They're not seeing that violence. They're not having that many direct experiences with prisons. Maybe they have cousins or extended family. They know that somebody's gone to prison, but it's not taking food off of their plate. Their defining experience of Blackness is how Black do the other white people treat you. And most white people,
and potentially, I do believe that's potentially why a lot of that subsect, that part of culture, gets so obsessed with the microaggressions that live in those communities, right? Because maybe for many of those Black people, the worst part of being Black they ever experienced was the rudeness of fake politeness, if that makes sense. And so I can give you an example of shifting from one place to another. When I moved from the East Coast, where most real racism was out in your face, and then I moved to the Midwest, and it was all done in that very sort of aside, backhanded, polite way. My immediate response was like, this is way more gross, because it's almost being delivered in this sort of condescending, I'm so much smarter than you, you'll never recognize this way. And then I went, moving into the entertainment industry, I see so much more of that. And so that is so pernicious to me, where it's like, no, I'm much more comfortable with the guy who's like, I don't like black people and they can just stay the fuck out of my way. Like, I like that guy more than the person who's like, I love black people. I would have no, you know what I mean? And so there is this, I moving from one place to another, I got to experience both, maybe in a way that very few white people do, where as an outsider looking in and growing up, like one of my mom's boyfriends after my parents' divorce was black. So I got to grow up in an interracial relationship in the 90s in a very racially divided place, or as the kid of one of those relationships, and experiencing that extreme racism from both sides, from black people and white people. And then to move to the Midwest, where people pretended things like that were okay, but you could tell they really weren't. That to me was more insidious. That was more, it was just more villainous. Like, to see the way that people would go out of their way to hide their anger, their racism, or their discomfort.
I haven't spent too much time comparing the two, although I do understand that there's a comparison to be made there. I will say that the uncertainty of it, so the polite version, the uncertainty where I don't really know what I'm getting, that is off-putting. Because, like, again, coming from poorer communities, my main fears have to do with, like, body. It's like, Can I feed myself? Can I clothe myself? And does this person dislike me enough to where they'd be okay engaging in violence against me? So that racist dude that you were caricaturing, it's like, okay, well, I know what he might be willing to do, and I can stay him. And I can avoid him, right? Yeah. It's sort of like, it messes with your trust receptors and your self-defense mechanism to say, like, well, like a fire I can recognize from a distance and stay away from. Someone who is nice to my face and fucking me behind closed doors, that's much more of a risk to me, because I could be tricked into. That's a harder threat to identify. Yeah. So in a weird way, I guess I'm more comfortable with outward racism than I am with passive aggressivism, because one is much more easier to avoid and the other is much harder to pop out and to recognize. And, you know, that's definitely got me into trouble in my career in terms of the way people perceive that stuff from the outside in, because, again, that's just my perspective. And this idea of, like, there is so much done on the back of polite racism. And that's a lot in what my comedy was when I started. Like, I started in black clubs. I started doing all black comedy clubs and black nightclubs. And so the way that I got in was basically like, here's all the things that white people say to me because I'm white, and I'm going to share these things with you guys. And people found that entertaining and they enjoyed it. And in a weird way now, the turn is like, don't tell people what we talk about behind closed doors. Don't dime us out. And then there's this other thing now where there's almost like this complicit agreement by a lot of middle upper class black America that's like, well, we participate in some of that classism against our own race as well, and so now you're telling on us too, and that's a problem. And so the war stopped being about sort of black and white and tattling on what one race says about another race to now being a classism thing of saying, like, oh, now that I've worked in Hollywood and I've had a television show and I'm behind closed doors, here's how all of these people that pull these levers perceive you and think of you, and here's the truth. And a lot of people don't like to hear that. And then the industry's answer to that is, well, what does he know? He's just a fucking white guy. And it's like, oh, it's interesting how you've weaponized that against me, that I'm revealing all of your secrets. And very much so, that's what resonated with me about what you wrote. And, you know, sort of this idea of, like, there is this weird sort of club behind closed doors of, like, well, we'll let in the blacks, but it'll be our blacks from our schools, from our neighborhoods, from our cultural sphere, and then that will appease the townsfolk, so to speak, right? It's sort of this dismissive elitism. So I would say that anytime something like this is happening, I would say that there are, say, bad actors who are in the know, people who know, they can see what's happening, they can see the dynamic, and they know how to push in a direction that benefits them. But I also, and this is unprovable and I could be wrong about it, there's just some plain old-fashioned ignorance or naivete as far as I'm concerned with many people. So here's
Well, and
one way.
I think you see it now a lot with COVID too, where there is like this sort of listen, I'm not going to die on this hill. I've got it too. Like I'm in this, you know, when we talk about, I've had a few guests on where we've talked about the Black hesitancy towards the vaccine and where that stems from and what it's from. And there are a lot of Black celebrities who are just like, I'm not even going to acknowledge that. Like, I'm not even going to open up the door to that or even be open-minded to it because I don't want to jeopardize being in the good spot that I am with the great job and the great income and everything else. And then you see folks like Nicki Minaj come out and go, I understand it. And just that alone is like, get this bitch out of here. You know, and immediately she becomes an enemy of the state because she's just willing to accept or be open-minded to the idea that, you know, some people's experience might make them more hesitant or less receptive to this idea. And, you know, it's so interesting to me to see how quickly those people who, you know, traditionally would be perceived as an ally, how easy it is for them to become an enemy. So, like, when somebody first hears me, a lot of times I get accused of policing Blackness and running with that. And that comes from a fundamental misunderstanding, because what I'm actually policing is poverty. And I'll say that up front. I am policing the definition and who is and isn't currently in that definition and those experiences. I'm doing that 100%. I'm minding that fence like fucking as hard as I can. So if I were to say to somebody, you know, one of these people who accused me of this, it's like, if I just randomly want to say white privilege isn't real, and they would of course disagree with that. And I would say, well, what proof do you have? And as soon as we say, what do you have in your arsenal to prove it? They're going to come into the territory that I'm very comfortable with, which is the statistics. It's the differences in who experiences these different oppressions that happen in society. Everyone is at risk of going to prison. The risks are different. Everyone is at risk of having a shitty police department where nobody does background checks to see if somebody's been kicked out of 3 departments. But the risk is greater for this particular group. And they're going to do all these things. So it's like, this list of grievances, this is the thing that defines Blackness for you. It's being at higher risk of these experiences than other white people. Well, than white people. I'm going to bring class into this and look at each of these risks. And what I'm going to find again and again is that they're separated by class. Right. And so if we go one step further in this statistical defense, which is all you have to prove this thing that is vital to the movement, we're going to find that it's segregated by class. And so essentially all of the suffering that you need to use as political currency to get white Americans to think that this is a front of the line issue is being generated mostly by the Black poor. And there's no getting around that. I mentioned the mass incarceration statistics. We can do that with who lives in the most lead-infested areas. We can do that with who's suffering the most police violence. We can do that looking at which Black trans people are the most likely to experience mob violence or police violence. Again and again, you're going to see that the majority of the people producing these statistics of oppression and suffering that are necessary to galvanize the public to think this is an issue, they come from one class of people. So, well, and comedian Ty Rivera talks about that. I mean, in his very sort of fun way. Ty is a conservative Mexican gay comedian. So he's very, you know, they hate the boxes that he falls into. But one of the things he talks about is, you know, the fact that, you know, a lot of trans people are the victims of violence is generally the poorer trans people who can't afford the cosmetic surgery that would essentially allow them to be more passing, you know, as much as people hate that word, but that's really what it boils down to. So where you see a lot of the violence is, to your point, not necessarily race-based, although you probably could find the statistic that would support the idea that it is because of who ends up being in that class. But it really boils down to economics of, like, generally the victims of crimes or you know, those types of hate crimes are because they have less money and are less present less as the gender they're attempting to, because of the socioeconomic or the economic barriers to becoming more passable. So as it's said. Yeah. So
I mean, there's validity there. If you can pass, you're less likely to set off the radar of someone who does harbor that sort of zealous hatred of trans people, because they won't be able to pick you out as a target for it. Something else there that doesn't get mentioned that often, but it's like, I now have enough money to where if I only ever want to live around white liberals who will pay me absolute deference for being brown and of Black heritage, I have that option. Yeah. I can choose to surround myself. If you're familiar with like Old City, I'm sure you are, Old City in Philadelphia.
Oh, of course.
I was at like United by Blue, which is like a hipster coffee shop that I really love that not many people know about. But I was talking to this one white guy who had been doing like, nonprofit work over in Hawaii. And he comes back and he's talking about how it can be lonely there for like a white person, because a lot of the Native Hawaiians don't fucking like you because you just represent the people who have gentrified their island. And he was saying how he totally gets that because he was very liberal. And he's like, yeah, I understand why they're mad at me. You just have to accept that when you go over there. And the topic of my race comes up because I said like, okay, I'll keep in mind that there's dangerous areas in Hawaii. And he was like, oh, I mean, you would probably like, they probably wouldn't notice. Could I ask like what you are mixed with? And I was like, Black and white. And he just looked at me for a quiet moment of contemplation, then said, that's beautiful. It's like, wow, if I wanted to, I could only spend all of my time with white people who are willing to say shit like that to me.
Right.
Whereas
Exactly.
Like, if I'm poor and Black or poor and trans or poor and indigenous, I get what I get. I can't move to the places where people
and geography.
Yeah,
geography plays a role in that too. You could just end up being in a place that is the least tolerant of whatever bucket you fall in, and that's just a bad roll of the dice. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
You could also be a poor trans person born in Oakland, and you're over the bridge from the most accepting place in the world. And all you got to do is figure out how to get over the bridge. Whereas if you're in like Mississippi, you got a much longer train ride to get the fuck away from hatred.
Yeah, like again, going back to New Jersey, it's like so I graduated high school in 2006. So not that long ago, a friend of mine, a white friend who had more of a hipster aesthetic, walks into the local ice cream shop where he had used to work, and he knows the people there. He's just got cuffed salvage jeans. And a 17-year-old girl says to him, why are you dressed like, well, basically the most slanderous term for gay, but why are you dressed that way?
Yeah.
And this is a 17-year-old girl who just
this is in Philadelphia, by the way?
No, this is in just New Jersey.
Oh, in Jersey.
The segue I was going to say is like, but right across the bridge in Philly was always, the gayborhood, where like you could just escape what was very normal. Like you're that close, and yet even in 2006, people just say ridiculous shit in my part of New Jersey.
But I just love, but there's a weird thing of like, I love that. There is a thing that the East Coast has where the West Coast doesn't have that, where there is that volatility. Like you can literally be in a place that feels safe, and then there's one of those dinosaurs will walk in and be like, what are all these blacks doing sitting over here at the bar? You know what I mean? It's just like, but you kind of got to love that, because to me, those are like walking museums. Like they are reminders of how things used to be. And I think in a way it makes you appreciative of where they're headed. And so I find myself less angry at those things than I was when I was in my 20s. Because in my 20s, I'd be like, someone has to change that, man. And then now I look at it and I go, in 10 more years, all those guys will be dead, and we'll be arguing over pronouns and microaggressions and things that don't really matter. And we'll forget that it used to be a much more harrowing place to live. And there used to be much deeper, more real, more violent and prevalent concerns. In a weird way, it's like going back to our earlier analogy, there will be no more fires. There will only be, a flickering electric appliance in your kitchen, and you're like, is that a fire hazard or I don't know. And so that in a weird way, and maybe this isn't, good, but I like that there are still identifiable fires out in the world where you can go, look, that's how bad it could get, versus us arguing over whether the blender or the food processor poses the bigger fire threat in the kitchen. That makes sense. It's a weird analogy.
No, it makes sense. I would say depending on each person's degree of sardonicness and like of those sorts of silver linings, that's more or less bomb. I do think there's value in knowing, like I was a history major before I went to education. I think there's a tremendous value in knowing like what it used to look like. I also believe that there's tremendous benefit for Americans to be able to like look at other countries and just knowing like, and there's places where it's still pretty shitty.
It's still like that.
So I do think that that's helpful for like, you should have a sense of scope and balance and be able to understand, you know, Bill Maher references this all the time, but like degrees are real.
Yeah.
I get that. I will say that I'm not, I don't want to spend time with that person, but the fact that they're going to die soon, that's nice. On the other hand, I will say that this is maybe getting to the slightly more dangerous territory, but just, you know, if we're going to talk about like East Coast culture, and we already brought up the Dave Chappelle thing, something that's, you know, interesting to me. And I'll throw this out here. You can't find this on your own anymore because Amazon bought IMDb and then made all their movie statistics behind a paywall. But you used to be able to look up like top box offices of all time. And like for the top 10 highest grossing like comedy specials of all time, like 8 out of the top 10 were Black men. If you were to look up highest grossing movies controlled for inflation of all time, none of the top 10 are led by Black people. So this is a really powerful thing culturally to notice that most of those Black people who make up that top 8 come from rougher settings, either the bottom of working class or they come from poverty. Something that's interesting to me about
it's interesting you bring that. It's interesting you bring that up because you're talking about there was an article that came out through this whole Chappelle thing this week that compared what his special does in terms of, so there's a metric that Netflix uses to determine value, which is essentially they correlate viewers and then they ascribe what the cost of subscription is to them. And then they sort of have a formula to where they say, this is how much a show is worth. And then they measure that against what it costs. And essentially Dave Chappelle breaks even because he's very expensive. And the correlation of viewership to what he costs versus what he, you know, earns is not as high of a ratio of something like Squid Game. So Squid Game famously cost about 20 million and created about $900 million of value for Netflix, whereas Dave cost about 100 million and made about 100 million. But again, to your point, you're comparing a series, which is 9 hours of content, to a 1 hour stand-up special. And again, if you were to compare Dave's content to all other stand-ups, you see that him as a Black man stands out and leads this category by far and away, right? Yeah. And in a way that doesn't happen in film and television. So I feel like when Ted Sarandos came out and made his initial statement of like, Dave has a tremendous value in this space, and we think it's important that his voice is heard, and we're not going to do anything about it. People immediately started to try to find that comparison to say, well, Dave really doesn't make that much money, you know, for Netflix compared to these other projects. And it's like, yeah, but in the stand-up world, he's the most important. And that is the only space, which I didn't know until you said, where Black people do hold that number 1 through number 10 spot. And so it's even more important because it's the only category in entertainment that is Black male led.
Yeah, for right now, and people who are comedy enthusiasts, they got a little sampling of this in my piece in Current Affairs, but there's 3 major parts of comedy, which you already know and probably know much better than me. Basically, people who come up through writing and people who come up through improv and people who come up through stand-up, and 2 out of the 3 is very highly educated and often very wealthy, whereas stand-up has this low bar where even just a few years ago, Gerard Carmichael can just, anyone who's seen his family documentary knows the sort of project poverty that he comes from, and he can just step right in to stand up. And not only is he stepping in, and this is something that's normally very important to liberals, he's normal there. The top 8 guys of all time, many of them come from his same background. So he's not like he doesn't have the burden of being like a pioneer for poor Black people getting into stand-up. It's like he's expected to be able to succeed. He's not weird the way he would be if he was going to the SNL writers room and he's the only person who hasn't been to Harvard.
Well, and what's so interesting about that is really, and that's I think why I love stand-up, is it's arguably the most meritocracy based of the art forms. And you truly are an individual, meaning like when you're on stage, you're by yourself. Sketch is a team thing. Improv is a team thing. Writers' rooms are groups. And so it is interesting, much like cage fighting. People go, why is cage fighting popular? Is it the violence? Is it the this? And it's like, no, I think people have this love for something that has a sense of pure meritocracy, meaning at the end of the day, no matter who comes from the most money, who has the best training, which guy has the better genetics, at the end of the day, they're going to close that fucking cage door and the better man on that day is going to win. And I do think, this is what black audiences love about stand-up is like, motherfucker, when you're on stage, you're either funny or you're not. And they don't care about where you come from. They don't care about what your background is. They don't care about it. White audiences care about that shit. And they're trying to bring that mentality of the writer's room and improv and sketch to stand-up audiences now.
There's stand-up courses at art colleges now.
Right. Yeah. So they are trying to infiltrate and change. But what people have always loved and what I love about stand-up is it is a meritocracy. At the end of the day, no matter what my preparation is, what my background is, or any of that, I have an obligation to go be funny for that time I'm on the stage. And if I don't, there's no one to blame but me. There's nobody to point the finger at but me. And there's nobody who can fix it but me.
I would agree. I mean, I'm a guy who loves to have nuances, you probably noticed, but I would say like, as long as all other things being equal, you haven't been blacklisted or canceled or like denied,
too late.
denied access to it. And your definition of success is how many people laugh when you open your mouth. There's some very real meritocracy in comedy, provided all those things are there. It's like, we can count up who makes the most people laugh. That's very straightforward. I will say the other thing that interests me there, and I think touches on these two different cultures, is that culture that Richard Pryor's comedy comes from, or that say rap battling comes from, has a very contextual interpretation of language, which is like, if I walk up to somebody and I just say the word, nigga, you need to know the relationship between me and that person. Like I can say that same word to different people. And depending on our history, our relationship, the tone of the room, there's an understanding of either I'm saying a term of endearment or I'm trying to start a fight or belittle someone. And many, many words are used that way in poor black cultures. It's a contextual thing, and we trust that other people can more or less read the room and understand the context in which something's being said. This is not a judgment. This is just an observation. Many of the more middle and upper class white liberals who are being involved in comedy and critiquing it, they come from a perspective that language should not be very contextual. There should actually be words that are interpreted in only one way, that you don't read the room. That's really not relevant whether or not the people hearing the joke or hearing you know whether you mean it in fun or in jest or whatnot. There's just rules to language, and context or our ability as social animals to read a room doesn't matter. It's a completely different vision than the black version or the poor black version.
And what's interesting is that I've run into that myself. And I've never thought to argue from the perspective of, no, I'm a poor person, not a white person, meaning like poor people, the context matters very much, or it's just very much ingrained in the way we interact with each other.
Whereas, you fuck with each other all the time. Now, if you fuck with somebody who's your best friend, you can be a complete savage, but the understanding is that you guys are friends, so it doesn't matter. You tell the same joke to somebody who doesn't like you, you're fighting.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's a very hard thing for people to wrap their head around. Like when I would go on the road and tour, when I had amassed a lot of material when I was very new to comedy. So like a year into comedy, I was going out and headlining small shows, which really doesn't happen that fast for people. And I would take black comics with me. And then when I would go out and feature, I would so often feature with other black comedians in the Midwest. And so I would talk about things socially or like racially. And those black comics that I'm friends with, that I would travel with, would understand the context. And then when you would bring those jokes or bits or concepts to Los Angeles, people just look at the face of a white guy and go, there's never an okay reason for you to talk about this or to address this or to use this language. And it's like, no. I'm making the same kind of points. I'm just doing it from a different perspective. And I'm doing it from the perspective of somebody who is, like I said, witnessing this thing almost from like behind enemy lines. And so it's so interesting to me. Like there are times when I would go through like cancellation moments in the industry, and then I have black comedian friends of mine who are defending me, going like, you just don't understand him and you don't understand where he comes from. And then you'll have other black people telling them that like, you're a fucking race traitor if you support this person because you know them, rather than trying to understand, well, what do you know about his circumstance, or what do you see in that bit? Like a great example is I had a bit that I did on my 2012 album and that I did a long time ago where I talk about my dad like making a comment to me and using the N-word, and then instead of correcting him about whether or not that's okay, I correct him that his racism is out of date and that it's more in style to be racist to Middle Eastern people, which is what my girlfriend is, than it is to be racist towards black people. And so my black
times, Dad.
Right, exactly.
No one
So
even
I
does
don't condemn his use of the N-word, and in fact, in the bit I use it myself, right? But I'm basically saying that you're out of date. And you know, Kevin, my longtime opener, my good buddy Kevin Kraft, black comic, when I recorded my album, he came upstairs and sat down with me. The club was downstairs, the bar was upstairs. He came up and he goes, "Man, I love that joke because in a lot of ways it highlights how really like when white people think they're being progressive and that they're advanced, they're actually just racist in a whole new different way." And he goes, "I see that all the time." And so you as a white comic are speaking to me as a black person in a way where you're letting me know that you see something that I experience, and not everybody's going to pick up on that. And so to me, like having that conversation with my friend lent credibility to that joke to go, okay, so what the intent of that joke is actually coming across to the audience it's meant for. And the people who get most outrage or got most outrage at that bit while I was doing it are white people who miss that point because they're participating in it. Does that make sense? And so all they're doing is attacking the language, and they're not picking up on the, as you often use the word nuance, they're not picking up on the nuance of like, I'm addressing a cultural phenomenon that is evolutional racism and not condemning racism, like almost like evolving your racism, but not curing it. And that actually, to me, is one of culture's biggest threats right now, is an evolutionary racism in replace of fundamentally questioning it. And it has become almost my life's work in my comedy, because it has been the thing that I am most misunderstood for and most under attack for, where people believe, well, not only are you not doing it, but you're incapable of doing it because you're a white person. It's like, no, maybe as a white person, I understand this because I see it more, because I am behind enemy lines and I see this subtlety. It's like we talk about the bigotry of low expectations. To me, that is one of the most pernicious and prevalent forms of racism that I see today, and particularly from the left, where I see this sort of bigotry of low expectations of like when the Joe Biden thing about, a lot of black people can't even figure out how to get to the DMV or get an ID or learn how to vote. It's just like, come on, man. Like, that's the kind of shit that guys like me experience, because we're the ones that are, but maybe in those circumstances, black adjacent, but white presenting, to where white people will come up and go, these fucking people, am I right? And then you just go like, what makes you think we're on the same team, you know? And so
I see what you're saying.
I try, and maybe it's because I just have to get better at it. I mean, I'm willing to accept that, but it is important to me to highlight this idea that a lot of the things that are done in the name of progressivism are actually quite regressive, and actually not curing the problems, but just shifting them.
Lot to unpack there.
Well, listen, we're coming up on time. We'll save it for the after show. We'll get into that. But before we jump into the after show, Bertrand, do you have anything you want to plug coming up that we can send people to follow you? Go follow you on Twitter at Black Trash. By the way, that's your moniker that you chose, not what I picked for you to go into the podcast. Just so people know, they can follow you on Twitter at Black Trash. Do you have a website or anything else you want people to check out?
No, there's nothing to plug right now. I wrote the piece. I would say, like, if you haven't read the current affairs piece, please do. Everything I do is just going to end up on Twitter right now. So just @_Black Trash. I've been so busy with this article that I can't say I have anything really cool to plug, and there's no other website. So following me is super simple.
There you go. People can go over there, and then we'll jump into the after show. We'll get to our questions, and we'll wrap up. You know, I don't want to cut you off there in your response to that, but we'll save that for the after show, and then we'll throw you some of our shitty questions.
Nice. I'm looking forward to the shitty questions.
Yeah, man. And thanks so much for doing the show. It's been great.